when you're a nurse, you get a lot of anxiety and you're scared of a patient falling. But I feel like most places, the management understands that falls do occur, and it's usually not the nurse's fault.
I gotta go. I've been working, told them please don't hit my phone. I'm in my zone, bruh, just leave me alone. Was on the road, but I swear I'm coming home. Now the drinks on me, I think we need a toast. See, I did it for me. Now my old friends calling, told them nothing's for free. Told me time is money, dog, swear I paid all my fees. I was starving for this game, now my family can eat.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Couple of Nurses Show, here with your hosts, Peter and Matt, two nurses on a mission to change this world, one conversation at a time. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If you find value in the show and want to join us on this mission, please share and review the show. It would mean absolutely everything to us. CoupleNurses.com for the latest info, updates, and what we're up to. And also you can check out our resource page for a bunch of nursing freebies on there. For our lifestyle podcast, you can check out wearefrontlinewarriors.com.
On this episode, we are going to talk about patient falls. We're going to share our experience when our patients fell. We're going to talk about how we felt, what we had to do, and we're also going to share some statistics and common reasons why patients fall at the hospital.
I think this is one of the most scariest topics to talk about. I know death is, but death is something that's sometimes out of your hands, out of your control. You can't do things to prevent it. It's just God in this case. When it comes to a fall, there's things you can prevent, things they can take, and steps and action steps. And when they're missed, something happens, it freaks you out, man. The previous contract we worked at, they literally threatened with falls so much where they say they're going to terminate your contract. One fall. There's no buts. There's no excuses. You got to go.
Yeah, sometimes I'm more worried about a patient falling than I am about them dying. Just because a patient doesn't just die all of a sudden. Usually things lead up to a patient death, or they're really in a serious problem. They really have a really big issue going on, maybe a stroke, any kind of like giant comorbidity, versus like a fall. A fall can happen whenever. A patient could have a bad dream and they could fall. A patient could turn and they could fall. A patient could be delirious, have delirium, be in a bathroom, could fall. So I feel like there's a lot more chances of a patient falling on you than a patient dying on you. But of course, if you're in the ICU and a patient is intubated, sedated, the chance of that person falling, probably low. Chance of dying is a lot higher. But on a typical hospital floor, the chances of somebody falling are a lot higher than somebody dying.
100%. That was like my first case when things like that happened, was on the floor. So we're going to share some experience of our falls. Peter and I each had a fall. I've had one. How about you?
Just one.
Just one. Okay. Yeah. So let the stories rip. So this started probably like my first year as a new grad nurse. I was on an observational unit. So on an obs unit, sometimes there's a lot of influx of patients where you might start your shift. There's like 2 patients, but it could go up to 6 in Chicago. So you're just getting influx of patients. And I had an older guy that was somewhat confused, or Alzheimer's early on, family left, took care of him, was running around. I'm pretty sure I didn't put a bed alarm. Let's see. Details are getting a little funny here. No. There was no bed alarm because I walked in on him and he was...
So I'm going to stop you. I hope we aren't incriminating ourselves in any way in this episode, because that would be some shit.
Yeah, I know, right?
It's all said in good faith.
All said in good faith, and take everything with a grain of salt. It may or may be true or falsify. You can't use this information in court.
Or against us anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if this is good enough as if taking a verbal right now before I share some scoop here of what's happening.
I'm glad we think about that now instead of before I started talking.
Yeah, and I think I walked in on him and I saw him fall. It was like a late night after 12 o'clock. I'm trying to, just round on my patient, see him fall, and I just like freak out as a new grad, freaking sweating, trying to figure out what to do. My first intention was, oh my God, I don't want to be caught with the fall. What do I do? Let me just pick this guy up and put him back in bed and just like call it a day because he looks good. And, I kind of first took a look in the bed. I didn't call anybody right away. I'm like, okay, let's scope out this situation. And I noticed he had like a little hit on his knee and it was bleeding.
Little hit?
Yeah, he had a little bruise, little cut scrape on his knee. I noticed like a drop of blood on the floor and I'm like, okay, this is a lot more serious. Not something I should just try to lift the patient, put him back in bed. Let's escalate this to the chain of command. Told my charge she came into the room, told the situation. So we called the resident, we called the house supervisor. They do their basic assessment to make sure there's no changes in LOC. He was confused to begin with, so it was hard to get a baseline of what's going on. So we just sent him down for a CT scan and ended up just calling the family and everything's okay. Afterwards, of course, we padded the rails a lot more, or try to plan the escape so he can't get away, arm to bed alarm and all that good stuff. But yeah, the first time I was really scared because I thought something bad is going to happen to me, where like they take you to the office and all that. As a new grad, I don't want that underneath my belt and potentially affect from getting a first Daisy Award and all this stuff. So
Yeah, I lost Daisy Award. Darn. Yeah, I feel like it's when you're a nurse, you get a lot of anxiety and you're scared of a patient falling. But I feel like most places, the management understands that falls do occur, and it's usually not the nurse's fault. It's just the patient kind of messes up in some way. Yeah, we try to prevent things as much as we can, but in like the defense of the nurse, it's usually the patient did something that they weren't supposed to, and that's what caused that fall. It's not like negligence or we don't care. It's just there's a lot of scenarios that can happen in a hospital. People aren't in their home; they get delirious. I will talk about some of the most common ways of falling, about patients falling a little bit later. But there's so much scenarios that can happen. There's so much things that can go wrong with falls, and you just throw in some small delirium or just confusion, sundowning, and that just drastically increases the chance of that patient falling. So what you have to do after that fall?
yeah, so like I said, after chain of command happened and we got a CT scan, talked to the family, let them know that this patient was confused to begin with there, where they wanted to know if everything's okay because I talked to them. And the rest of everything was settled. There was no acute brain bleed, and he just continued his day, put a little Band-Aid on his like knee where he had that scrape. And I just continued my day. And then when the shift ended, I filled out a UOR. I don't know if it's called a UOR file or
Like an incident report?
like an incident report that just explained the chain of events that happened, what steps I took to prevent this to happen, and what happened afterwards. So I can't recall if I got talked to or not. I think it was more of like a debrief with my charge a couple days afterwards to just make sure that she got everything right, because she's the one that goes and presents these cases and what we could have done differently.
Yeah. Did you have to do like any extra charting or like a progress report, or just the incident report?
Yeah, good question. I just made a note. Hey, found patient at 1800 or 1900, like 0100, whatever the time is, on the floor. Unknown injuries. Described his mental status. Described how he talked to the charge. Escalated chain of command. Just like the little incident and the events that happened during that time. So it was very brief. And of course, this happened over 6 years ago. Now that I've been a nurse for so long, so I'm trying to remember those little vague details to this story. But yeah, it wasn't as bad as me floating one time as an ICU nurse in the same hospital to another floor, and there was like a very low map that was recorded by a CNA. She didn't clear it off the computer, and she rechecked the vitals, which was a better number. I left that one, and it was just left in a chart that in the morning the BPs were in the 60s or 70s. Nothing was done. I got more in trouble for that, thinking that I'm exercising or practicing nursing outside of my scope of practice, where I didn't call a physician and get a bolus or whatever. But at the end of the day, it was my license, and she charted under my license that it was like a low BP and there was no actions or interventions being taken. So that's just my experience when it comes to the fall, or when I was delegating something to a CNA and it wasn't done and it came back on me.
Yeah. I feel like falls happen. Like there's always this goal of, hey, zero falls, but that's just not gonna happen. You'd have to literally strap somebody to the bed for them to not fall. It's just you're not gonna ever put them down to zero. We're not robots. Like, we're humans. Patients mess up. Staffing isn't always the best. You're not always sitting there with the patient, and even if there's a sitter, like, look how fast you could just stand up. Like, you have to have a response rate of like half a second to catch a patient, because you could have a sitter in the room one-on-one with the patient, but if the patient freaks out and just gets up and falls right away, that's like a second. It's like half a second. You have to be literally like right there, right next to the patient.
Yeah, especially if you're in another room, the whole unit is busy. There's no one at the nurse's station. Sometimes there's secretaries Peter's and I experience is mostly a night shift. There's usually no unit clerk, no secretary. You're handling everything yourself. Some floors don't even have CNAs. Like you have like 4 or 5 nurses running the show. Like falls are bound to happen, and you can't restrain everybody.
Yeah.
It's something that'd be great where there would be 0 falls, but look at the quality of life that patient is getting being strapped onto the bed, and look at the risk that they're taking having restraints continuously on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, how's your experience?
Yeah. It was very similar to yours. So in my case, I had a patient that came in. It was a CWA patient, and this was a patient that was technically A times 4, but was still confused. This patient was able to knew who he was, he knew where he was, he knew what he was doing. Completely A times 4, but if you ask other questions besides like a typical orientation questions, he was confused. Like he would just randomly sit up and he would not know why he's sitting up, but he'd still tell you all the A times 4 questions.
Someone with it.
Yeah, someone with it. And he came for CWA, and this was a person that I gave the most Ativan to ever in my life. And then they put this person on a Ativan drip. We put him on it at like 3-4 o'clock in the morning. He felt like around midnight, 1 o'clock. But I was actually orientating somebody when he fell. So I was in a cardiac step-down unit, and I had 3 patients, and one of them was the CWA patient, and I knew he was going to be an issue because he had a Foley, and he was one of those where he felt a Foley in him, and he felt like he had to go to the bathroom. And when you have one of those with confusion, then they want to get out of bed, and they feel like they have to go to the bathroom, so they naturally want to get out of bed and go to the bathroom. So it was a little tricky because technically he was A times 4 still, because he was like responding to my questions completely fine, but he was completely still off. So it was like one of those kind of weird scenarios where he's A times 4, but stuff that he's doing and stuff that he's saying besides the orientation questions just didn't make any sense. And this happened to be, we had the 4 side rails up, or 2 side rails up, and we had the bed alarm on. And I'd sat right in front of him so I could see him, and I had the curtain closed a little bit just for a little bit of privacy. And every now and then I would have to tell him again, like, hey, can you get back into bed? Because he wouldn't get out of bed, but he would like almost like lean over a side rail or try to sit up. And I had to keep reminding him, hey, stay in bed, stay in bed. And at this point in time, I stepped out of where I was sitting, checking a patient, and I came back and I sat down and I'm like, like I don't see this guy here anymore.
Where'd he go?
And I walk in there and he's sitting on the ground, like resting his back against the bed. And I was like, damn, he fell. He fell. And I had my orientee with me, and it was like the same thought with you. I'm like, damn, should I just pick him up? Should we just put him in bed? Nothing was hurt. He had no bleeding, nothing. I asked him what happened. He's like, I fell on my ass. I was like, okay, you fell on your ass, but I have an orientee here. I'm not gonna just hide this from happening. Like, first of all, that's not the right thing to do. Second of all, I literally have an orientee here. Like, how am I gonna show his orientee that this is what I'm just gonna do, right? So I'm like, you can't do it.
You're gonna lift him up, grab the legs.
Yeah. And even though I knew he was fine, it didn't seem like he hit his head. I asked him, hey, did you hit your head? No. And then he's like, I was trying to go to the bathroom. And I explained the whole full situation. He's like, oh, I don't know. And I was like, yeah, whatever. You knew, but you're confused. Keep moving along. And then we brought him back into the bed. Called the charge. Had to call the house supervisor. Had to get the NP. Everyone came in, did their assessments, and after that, even though he didn't hit his head, we still sent him down for the CT, just to make sure that, I know he said he didn't hit his head, but he's still a little bit confused. So we rather just rule out that there's no brain bleed, because maybe he hit his head and he just sat up and he forgot that he hit his head. So we don't want to take any risks. So basically that happened, and then similar to you, we had a little debriefing. Hey, what could you have done? What changed? This and that, and it wasn't anything serious. I didn't get reprimanded for it. I didn't get in trouble for it. I just had to do that incident report at the end of my shift, and then I just had to leave a little note and let the family know.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you do these incident reports, it's never against you to get you fired and all that. It's all just for the safety. There's teams and there's people that look at the debriefments and see what we can improve in the organization as far as systems or organizations or checklists or handoffs, whatever it is, to prevent this from happening. So it's all just, forgot the exact word is, but there's like those UB meetings to have like debriefs. Every single hospital basically has it. But
yeah, and with that patient, like, it was giving me was giving me a hard time all night. And then I kept asking him for, can I get something extra besides Ativan? And it was one of the things where everyone kept saying no. And I keep giving him Ativan. And you probably, I don't know if you remember, but there was like a picture that I sent to you one day when I was during that night, and there was like a bunch of vials of Ativan. And then there was like 12 vials of Ativan that I gave him throughout the shift before he put him on. He withdrawn that bad that he put him on before he put him on the Ativan drip. And then it was crazy because like we put on the Ativan drip and everything was fine, and he was on an Ativan drip for like maybe 4 hours, and then day shift came and freaked out like, there's an Ativan drip? Why is he on an Ativan drip? Because Ativan drips are not something that you see very commonly. And a physician did around was like, take him off the Ativan drip. So we took him off, and then he was calm. And then like when I came back the next day, he got a report. He was going wild. He was going wild. And they put him back on Ativan drip at around like 5 p.m. because they couldn't handle him. So it was one of those things where it was like, could this have been prevented if he got more medication? Maybe if maybe somebody listened to my honest opinion of what's going on and would have gave me what I was asking for, maybe it could have prevented, maybe not, who knows. But I feel like that's like a lot of cases too with patients like that, where you ask for something because they're sundowning or they're going through withdrawals and medication is not working, and you ask, and physicians are scared to give more medication because they're so used to just being within this threshold.
There's like a standard practice, and 3 to 6 milligrams for this US score, but that's not always the case for somebody that's been using and abusing drugs for a long time, like this guy maybe in this case.
Right, yeah, and I had to limit the amount of Ativan I was giving because, like I said, he was technically 8 times 4, but he was still like confused, but just somehow still was 8 times 4. So that's kind of how that happened. Never had a fall ever since, knock on wood. Hopefully I won't have a fall ever again, and hopefully you don't have a fall ever again.
Yeah, and I hope not. And in this episode, we're going to also talk about the most common causes of falls and give you guys some statistics when it comes to fall education, because we have patients coming all the time where you hear stories during change of shift when the charge or the leader's talking about this fall happened, how it can prevent it. So it's something that happens continuously in healthcare, even though there's like a statistics that falls occurred at 3 to 5% out of every 1,000 bed days. So it's a thing that's going to probably happen in your facility, God forbid, potentially to you, and you just have to know what to do when you do have a patient that falls.
Yeah, and they're a big cost for the hospital as well. So if a fall happens, the hospital is technically responsible for paying for that cost, whatever CT they go for, whatever changes that the patient has. The facility has to pay for that. So this is why they're so anal and so always all up in your face about fall assessments, fall prevention scores, all this kind of stuff, because they are liable for this no matter what happens. It has to be some kind of crazy scenario where the patient literally like jumped on you and then fell. Then that probably wouldn't cover it. But if a patient falls on you, the hospitals are responsible for paying for it. And it's just kind of how it works. That's why they're so anal about it. That's why with everything else, with like certain sepsis protocols, CAUDIs, collapses, all that, if a hospital is anal about something, that's only because they're having to pay for it. Yeah. If they can get that money out of insurance, they don't take such a worry about it because no matter what happens, they're going to get paid by insurance for it. But if the cost is then pushed on a facility, they're always going to be really, really strict on you doing all these measures to prevent this because they're going to get stuck with the bill.
Yeah, especially with like sepsis, I think that's a new core measure that was added. And that's a podcast episode we could cover in the future, is different core measures and how the billing works for Medicare and hospitals, and how it ends up in our hands to worry about things and making sure protocols are done, or sepsis and lactic is repeated in 6 hours because they get dinged for this, and affects, again, their pockets, and that ultimately affects your pay raise and how you get promoted in your hospital.
Yeah, and about 10% of all the falls only result in serious injuries. So most falls aren't anything serious. They're low risk falls. They don't hurt the patient, or they don't hurt the patient, or they hurt them in like a minimal way, or they don't hurt them at all. 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but still, let's try to bring that down. And usually that 10% is with like a serious case. Most of those 10% are not just somebody maybe tripping, but it's more about, it happens more when someone's confused, delirious, going through withdrawals, and like they're in a heavy disease state where a fall results in a serious injury. Something really serious has to happen.
Yeah, one case I just think about right now is when I was working a ortho unit. There was a fresh knee that came in. They had a pinning of the knee, and she was just off a bunch of stuff, right? And when there was bed alarms going off and monitors, she thought that she was getting robbed in her home because she had a past history of that. So she was literally fighting for her life, trying to get out of bed because she thought a robber was home, and she ended up falling and fracturing something in her knee or some area of her leg where she needed to get another surgery. And the family was so upset where they were pressing charges for that. But again, just like you said, that's like less than 10% of serious cases where it goes to that degree where you might have to go to court or the patient actually gets seriously harmed.
Yeah, it has to be a crazy scenario where this happens, and that, like you mentioned, is definitely a crazy scenario. But maybe we should touch upon a little bit of what you should do when your patient falls, just in case you're maybe a new nurse or a new grad and haven't experienced a fall. Hopefully you don't, but we'll just go over real quick on the things you should do, steps you should take if a patient falls. So the first one is don't leave the patient alone if he falls on you. Call for help, hit the call light, just shout out of the room, hey, can somebody help me? Have somebody come there with you, because the fall might be serious or it might not be serious. Most of the time it's not gonna be too serious, but still don't risk you leaving the room, patient getting up and then falling a second time. Just always stay with them. Treat it as like an MI. Treat it as like something is seriously going on with the patient.
Yeah. The next thing you want to do is assess the patient to see what happened. If they fell, are they having pain anywhere? Did they hit their head anywhere? Get an honest assessment, baseline of what's going on to see what happened, and ask if they're alert and oriented to see how they fell, what was the chain of events, because you're only taking subjective data at that point. The only objective data is when you're making a patient note is found patient on the floor responsive, and then you could continue. So everything else is subjective to see if they hit their head and if there's any visible injuries.
Yeah, and you could also ask them, hey, what happened? How'd you fall? Because sometimes patients are completely with it. They just happen to fall. Maybe they had a privilege just to walk to the bathroom. They just happened to get up too quick, got lightheaded, sat down on the ground. It's considered a fall, even though they sat down. But they could tell you right away what happened. Hey, I got lightheaded. I didn't know where the bed was, so I just sat on the ground. And now you got the whole history of what happened, and now you don't got to freak out as much.
Yeah.
Third thing you should do is always notify a physician, your charge nurse, supervisor. Just abide by your hospital protocol of who and what you should do when a patient falls.
Yeah, the fourth thing, you may or may not, from the physician or the resident, get a CT scan depending on how bad the injury is. You want to take them down and knock that out stat to make sure they're not bleeding or there isn't anything small, like a small hemorrhage, which may lead to future LOC changes.
And of course, you want to notify family. If the family's in the room, let them know, hey, we're going to take your family member down to CT. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Or if the family member wasn't at the hospital and the patient's 800x4, just ask them, hey, do you want me to call anybody and let them know you fell? And then if they are confused, you definitely should call a family member. But if they're 800x4, they might tell you, hey, don't worry about it. You don't got to call anybody. I'm completely fine. I know what's going on. You don't got to notify anybody. Don't wake anybody up. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. But if, like I said, if they're confused or in the ICU or they're critically ill, you should definitely notify somebody in the family.
Step number 6, you're going to make that patient a fall risk forever. Depending on how your hospital does things, you might make a note outside of the door, change his fall risk score in the chart, or change it on the door, whatever your policy does. In the previous contract it worked, it was like a little flip thing, right? Fall risk, medium, low, high, and then you put it onto the door. Step number 7, you're going to chart exactly what happens. That's make your note that's covering you and provide both objective and subjective data with time if you can on exactly what happened in the event.
Yeah, don't be too specific here because you don't really know what happened. If a patient tells you what happened, don't say patient fell because they got lightheaded. Just write patient fell and stated this. Just because you weren't there, you didn't visibly see what happened. And I know you might be correct, but just in case you're not, you're better off just covering yourself. Sometimes you're better off leaving it real broad instead of trying to get into details of why you think they fell, how they fell. You don't need any of that. Just literally chart and note what happened, and that's all, because you were not there during the fall.
End your note with, we'll continue to monitor.
Yes, sir.
And the last step, number 8, is to file an incident report based on how your hospital does it as well. And just, again, document those events so people that are in leadership could understand the event situation and create action steps or interventions to prevent that from happening in the future and in the organization as a whole.
And what are the most common reasons why patients fall? So we actually looked it up online, and what's interesting to see is that the first couple searches that you get off Google are from law firms, and they have their list of why patient falls. And then when you scroll down a little further, then you get like the JCO, the more of the hospital, more of the healthcare viewpoint on why patients fall, which was really interesting because I was thinking like why is there like a little bit of discrepancy between what law firms are saying the reasons our patient falls and why the healthcare system are saying the patient falls, is because law firm is writing it in a way to make it seem that you have something to charge the hospital with.
There's a blame.
Facility. Yeah, there's a blame. They have an incentive to write things a certain way versus the healthcare community doesn't really have that financial incentive. They have more of a closer viewpoint and a better understanding of what actually happens in the hospital versus the law firms. They have a better understanding of law, all that kind of stuff. So you're going to have a little bit of a discrepancy here.
So let's talk about what the law firm first provided. So some most common reasons for falls are failure to call a nurse for assistance. Always, of course, because we always tell patients when you orient them, hey, let us know if you need anything, use this call light, don't get out of bed on your own. There's also the bed exit alarm is not set. I think that's something that we're trying to do more of, like change of shift report in some hospitals. I notice where we're making sure to see if it's on. Sometimes those striker beds, they have a specific light, whether it's orange or green, to even notify if it's on or off when you're making your rounds at night. So another reason why they might fall. Patients are on high-risk medication. That happens a lot. If they're on sedatives in the ICU, sometimes we have them on Precedex and other medications, or they're withdrawing, give them an Ativan. Maybe even getting an Ambien or melatonin for sleep could mess them up and make them delirious at night. That could cause things. So we're a hospital, we give medication, so just be aware of what your patient is on, because that could provide a risk for fall. Inaccurate assessment, so that's maybe change of shift, maybe what the other nurse tells you, things get missed, you don't realize how much of a fall risk this patient actually is. There's a delayed response when a nurse is called, so that again goes to the call light, maybe the bed alarm is on and we're not getting there in time, and that kind of carries over into the nurse and staff shortage. If there's low staff, we're working really hard, there's no CNAs, well, the bed alarm might be ringing out a little bit longer, and it might take us some time to run there. But man, for all the nurses out there, like we run there to make sure everything's okay. So we genuinely do care about our patients. Slippery falls or slippery floors and surfaces. So we put patients on a non-slide slippers or socks, I should say, but just be careful whatever's on the floor. That's clearly a risk. Inefficient work environments. So again, that's just not being aware and critically thinking or being detail oriented to know when alarms are off or other things that create issues. And poorly lit and obstructed views. I feel like that's more of a night shift thing. You tell the patient to go to sleep, they forgot to put their bed alarm or their call light on, or they don't want to even put the light on in the room. They try to get up on their own, which goes back to the failure to call for a nurse and leads to issues, man.
Yeah. And like we really try our hardest. Like everybody runs in that room. If you see a patient stand up, everyone's in that room. If the alarm goes off, there's going to be more people in that room. So what Matt stated, those were the most common reasons that the law firms gave that patient falls. The next list over here that I'll go through is written by the Joint Commission and other healthcare facilities and other healthcare commissions that actually look at the research and see what are the most common reasons patients fall. The first one is fall risk assessment issues. So that could be anything from somebody completing the fall risk assessment inaccurately. Those could be the discrepancies between the way I rate a patient versus the way Matt rates a patient, and also inconsistency in those tools. So we have these tools, these assessments, these little abbreviations for these fall assessment things, but they're not bulletproof. Just because a patient has a low fall score doesn't mean necessarily that he's always going to be low for falls. And just because this patient is at high risk for falls doesn't necessarily mean they're always going to be a high risk. So there isn't always a really good system or rating system in place to accurately assess a patient, because there's been a bunch of times where a patient is a high risk for falls, but he's really actually fine. Versus when someone's been like a medium and a low, and you know that they're a little bit higher, you should keep an eye on them. Just because maybe they're a little bit more impulsive, but all the other categories are fine. But you know that just this impulsiveness is enough to get this patient to fall. But according to the fall risk assessment, everything else is low. That means it's low fall risk. So it's more of like a judgment call in that case.
Yeah, and it makes sense how Joint Commission is saying that, because I feel like in a previous contract, they're also honing in on this where they were doing audits on the Hester Davis falls, because if somebody falls and they were charted too low of a score and things happen, that could affect their magnet status, or I don't know what Joint Commission does, tells you, hey, like you're charting this wrong. So interesting how that's a predictor of risk for falls.
Another one is handoff communication issues. So this, I feel like, was a big player in the falls that they had in the Oakland hospital that we worked at, because they had 8-hour shifts instead of 12s. So the more nurses, the more handoff report given, the more amount of it, the more switches, there's a higher likelihood of something being missed.
Yeah, information is lost.
Yeah, information is lost in translation because it's going through more people, like a telephone game. Like if you line up 30 people and you whisper something in their ear, it's eventually going to get changed versus if you only have 3 people. So that is one of the issues. That's probably why one of the reasons why there is 12-hour shifts versus 8-hour shifts. It just benefits patient safety and handoff. And sometimes things get missed. It's an honest mistake. Sometimes I forget to tell you something, or you forget to tell me something, and it just happens. You're responsible for so much that sometimes you just forget to say something in an assessment. Like maybe you forgot to mention that the patient tried to get out of bed at 3:00 in the morning, or maybe you said that for a wrong patient, but meant to say for this patient. Because if you have zero med surg, you have like 4, 5, 6 patients. Sometimes it's very easy for things to get kind of intertwined, because you're always worried about these 6 patients. You're always thinking about them. Or sometimes you forget that what happened to this patient, you get maybe flipped to a different patient. That's a common mistake I feel like I see in med surg. They tell you about something and they're like, oh, never mind, that was about room 2, not 3.
Yeah.
This is what happened in room 3.
Yeah, and to add on, especially getting a report from day shift, like they don't know when the patient sundowns, how they are at night, if their Alzheimer's kicks in, more dementia, whatever it is. So I feel like sometimes just night shift itself gives us a whole array of different patients. Or how many times did you have IVs pulled off a patient, or they're going crazy at like 6:00, they're sleeping like angels, and they're perfect for day shift. So handoff is tricky. Sometimes you don't get the full picture of what happens with the patient. So that's why having a good baseline assessment is important, and then just hourly rounding on your patient, which, as you know, is a very difficult thing, having issues with staffing across America.
Another common cause of falls is toileting issues. This could be because you're putting somebody on a Lasix drip or giving them Lasix or any kind of diuretic, and they have to frequently go to the bathroom and they don't have a Foley. So that's one contributor to falls. Another one is a patient had to use the bathroom but didn't hit the call light. They didn't seek for help. They thought they could do it by themselves, and it was either a poorly lit environment, or they thought they could do it, and guess what? They can't. Or they got up too fast and they fell because they had to go to the bathroom. So toileting issues is one of the more common causes of why patients fall.
Another issue is a call light issue. So if the patient did not know, forgot to, or chose not to use the call light in general, that's like, I think, one of the main reasons why. If there's an alert patient, just communicate that. And a lot of the time, I feel like it comes down to autonomy. Patients feel like they have so much autonomy. Even when my family member was in the hospital, they're just getting up on their own. They think that, it's okay to do that. They don't understand the risk and severity of why we have these, policies and procedures in place, or don't want them to get up and have bed alarms. So sometimes it's like they feel like this is like some child game, and they just kind of want to do things on their own. Even old grandmas, man, they give us like the most smack about this. Call lights, come on, Or even back to the toileting issue, it's like you close the door because they want privacy, and you hear, there's a little hit on the ray. You're like, oh, what's going on? You okay there, Miss Becky?
Right, you tell them not to get up, to call before they get up, and you hear a toilet flush. It's like, all right, you're already up.
Yeah. Time to open the door. Your privacy's over, man.
Yeah, Miss Becky, I thought I told you to call before you got up. It's like, yeah, but I've been doing this for 60 years, had no problem. It's like, I know, but my manager wants me to always watch out for you, make sure you don't fall.
Yeah. The next one that Jayco listed is education, organizational culture issues. So that is the unit and the hospital as a whole. What are the standards of practice? Are they telling the nurses to use interventions such as checking call lights, maybe during hourly rounding, check up on their patients more frequently? So if there isn't good education to the nurses, then ultimately the organization as a whole is failing, and that could increase the risk of falls.
I feel like this is like a less of an occurrence nowadays than before, just because hospitals are so on top of you having to chart this, you have to do this, managers come around and check the bed's alarm, charges are even looking and assessing if the bed alarm's on, because that it's just been so engraved in us, this fall prevention stuff, that it's just like commonality. But of course, maybe the culture could be an issue if you're on a unit that maybe has like some stubborn nurses that have been there for years and years and years and don't want to change the way they practice nursing, and they refuse to put bed alarms on or put all the side rails on, because there's been a handful of times where there's a bunch of, for example, lift equipment. So it means to have a bunch of lift equipment, but the culture on the unit is to just lift it yourself. There's cranes, there's like the Hoyer lifts that are in the rooms. But
Steady fast, steady easy.
Right, yeah. But sometimes the culture on the unit is to just not use them and to just do it the old-fashioned way. So that could also be an issue, but I feel like that issue isn't as predominant as it used to be, unless you have those little bit of those stubbornness that really don't want to change. Another one that fits into this category is the patient's lack of awareness of their fall risk. A patient might think that they're fine, they could do this, they could do that, but they really can't. They got put on new medications, and they think that they're not going to have any adverse effects to these medications, especially blood pressure medications. But guess what? Today might be the day where you stand up and you get dizzy. I know you haven't got dizzy in the last 10 years, but we just increased your dose. Likelihood of you standing up and getting dizzy is a little bit increased now. But they don't really understand that, or they're not really aware of that, or they're just like, it's not gonna happen to me. But guess what? Sometimes it does, and sometimes you end up on the floor.
I agree, man. And the last one that Jayco mentioned is medical issues. So if the patient is on one or more medications that increase the risk of falls. So in that Hester Davis assessment, things are named out such as diuretics, laxatives, because you have to go to the bathroom, narcotics, antipsychotics, or antihypertensives, which could lead to potentially getting lightheaded from being hypotensive. So all those medications create fall risk. More than likely, your patient might be on one or two. So again, that's just
three or four.
3 or 4, yeah, 5 or 6. So just be careful of like what's happening with your patient, and maybe some couple of nurses tips. I mean, just honestly, just get a good baseline assessment. I think the bed alarm is a big thing. If you just put the damn bed alarm on, I know it's annoying. I know it sucks checking sometimes, but just put it on and round on your patient as much as you can, depending on what unit you have on, or talk to your CNA and delegate the hourly roundings to make sure everything's okay, and hopefully your patient doesn't fall. And if your patient does fall, you heard the steps in this episode, and it's not too bad. It's just going to be a learning experience, not to do whatever your mistake was again.
Yeah, one of the best advice I could give to prevent falls for nurses is to always do your hourly rounding. I know it gets busy and you might feel like you don't have enough time to get in a patient's room, but before you sit down, just make sure to peek in all your patients' rooms just to make sure everything's okay. Just to make sure you're safe, and to make sure they're safe, and also do a proper assessment and keep doing assessments when things start to change, because you might notice a little of a change with your patient, but then when you do a full assessment again, you might notice that, hey, this little change is actually a drastic thing. They might say something off just by a little bit. They might say something funny or something weird, and you might just ignore it. But if you wouldn't have ignored it and you would have just assessed their anal status, you may would have realized that, hey, this patient is a little bit more confused than I remember them being confused. So do your hourly rounds and do your proper assessments, guys.
Yeah, I was gonna add on. I don't know if do the walkers or the belts help at all.
The bells?
The belts. You just do the belt. You could hold your patient from the back, and you could just carry him with. It's a little bit more of a safety harness. So if you feel like you got a patient that's just unsteady, put one of those belts on for them.
Yeah, gait belt.
Yeah, the gait belt. Yes.
I don't think I've used that one in such a long time, but I see PT and OT using them a lot.
Yeah. If they're sometimes hanging on the this, not the sterile cup, the sterile processing, the sharps containers. I'll just put one on and slip one on depending on like what's happening, what the situation is.
Yeah, respectable. Look at you doing your due diligence and
Yeah.
being a patient advocate and all for anti-falls right here.
Yeah, man. I didn't get my Daisy Award, but I'm getting my Daisy Award through sharing good nursing knowledge and experience on the podcast.
You saw that you should be a leader of the falls committee on the next thing you work at.
Yeah, if your hospital needs some fall prevention, hit me up. I'll be here. I'll help them out. All right, guys. We'll see you on the next one. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Peace and love.
Bye-bye. See you next week.